You're kneeling in dry grass, somewhere in the Jordanian desert, and it's roughly 14,000 years ago. The sun is already brutal this early. The air smells like dust and dry stalks. The seeds in front of you are small, papery, hard as little pebbles. Bite into one raw, and you'll crack a tooth before you taste anything worth eating. Nothing about this plant says food. Look at it, and your first instinct, honestly, would probably be to walk right past it towards something that actually looks edible. And yet you're cutting the seed heads off with a sharp flint blade anyway, one stalk at a time, because someone before you figured out something the plant itself was never trying to tell you. That's the beginning of bread, not a kitchen, not a farm, a hard, tedious, multi-step secret pulled out of a grass that didn't want to give it up. So how did ancient humans actually invent bread? The honest answer might surprise you because it's older than farming, older than pottery, older maybe than almost anything you'd normally call civilization. Here's the assumption most people carry around without even questioning it. Humans settled down, planted crops, and then, only then, figured out bread. Farming first, bread second. That's the tidy version, the one that shows up in almost every textbook timeline you've ever seen. It's backwards, and the gap isn't small either. We're talking about a difference of thousands of years between when bread actually shows up in the archaeological record and when the first deliberate crop gets planted anywhere on Earth. 4,000 years, roughly, which is longer than the entire span of recorded history from ancient Egypt to right now. In 2018, an archaeobotanist named Amya Aransotigui, working out of the University of Copenhagen, published findings that quietly rewrote this timeline. An archaeobotanist, just so that's clear, is someone who studies ancient plant remains to figure out what people were actually eating. Her team had been excavating a site called Shubayqa 1, a hunter-gatherer camp out in the Black Desert of Jordan, home to a group known as the Natufians. The Natufians weren't farmers. They didn't plant seeds on purpose. They were foragers, moving with the seasons, eating whatever the land offered that year. Inside two ancient stone fireplaces at that site, the team found 24 small charred fragments, charred just meaning burned and preserved by fire, which is actually the reason they survived at all for archaeologists to find them 14,000 years later. Under a microscope, those fragments turned out to be bread. Flatbread, made from wild einkorn, wild barley, wild oats, and the ground-up tubers of a marsh plant called club rush. Think about how unlikely it is that this evidence even exists at all. Bread doesn't normally survive 14,000 years. It rots, it crumbles, it gets eaten by insects, it simply disappears, the same way almost every meal in human history has vanished without a trace. The only reason these particular fragments made it to a lab in Copenhagen is that they burned. A cook all those millennia ago let a piece scorch on the fire, or a stray ember caught the edge of a loaf, and instead of destroying the evidence, the char preserved it, locking the structure in place well enough for a microscope to read thousands of generations later. Every single thing we know from this one site exists because of an ancient kitchen accident. The date on this bread, roughly 14,400 years old. That's about 4,000 years before anyone, anywhere, deliberately planted a single seed in the ground. Hunter-gatherers, people with no farms, no permanent homes, no grain silos were making bread, and not by accident either. You don't stumble into this recipe, harvest wild grain by hand, strip off the tough outer husk, grind it into flour on a stone for hours, mix that flour with water, bake the dough in hot ash. That's 5 separate steps, minimum, and every single one of them had to be learned, taught, and repeated correctly, generation after generation, long before writing existed to record any of it. Skip a step, get the ratio of water wrong, or pull the dough off the ash too early, and you end up with something closer to burnt paste than food. This wasn't guesswork. It was a recipe, refined over who knows how many failed attempts, and passed down carefully enough that it still worked, essentially unchanged, 14,000 years later. Think about what that actually requires. Somebody has to know which wild grasses are even worth harvesting out of the hundreds growing nearby. Somebody has to know how long to grind. Somebody has to know that raw dough, pressed straight into ash, will cook through instead of just burning on the outside. None of that is obvious. All of it had to be figured out once, by someone, and then carried forward carefully enough that it survived being passed from memory to memory for thousands of years before anyone thought to write any of it down. But even Shubayqa 1 isn't the oldest clue in this story. At a site called Ohelo, right on the shore of the Sea of Galilee in Israel, an archaeologist named Ehud Weiss at Bar Ilan University found something even older. A large, flat grinding stone, worn smooth from use, with tiny starch residues still stuck in its surface after tens of thousands of years underground. The starch came from wild wheat, wild barley, wild oats. The site itself dates back roughly 23,000 years. 23,000, that's deep into the last ice age. Mammoths were still walking around, and somebody on the edge of that lake was already grinding wild grain into something closer to flour than to raw seed, kneeling on the same kind of stone you'd have knelt on at Shubayqa 1, thousands of years and hundreds of miles apart. Whether they baked it into actual bread or just ate it as a thick paste, they'd already cracked the hardest part of the whole puzzle. Take a seed your body can barely use and turn it into something your body actually can. And honestly, the grinding goes back even further than that. At a site called Grotta Paglice in southern Italy, researchers recovered a stone pestle dated to roughly 32,000 years ago, still holding traces of ground wild oat starch. The starch had been heated before it was ground, which tells you something important. Whoever used that tool wasn't just crushing seeds by accident. They understood that heat, applied at the right point in the process, made the grain easier to work with, easier to digest, better food. That's not one clever group in one lucky valley figuring this out once. Similar grinding tools from roughly the same era have turned up scattered across Ice Age Europe, as far away as Russia and the Czech Republic. This was happening, independently, in pockets all over the ancient world, tens of thousands of years apart from each other, with no possible contact between them. So why does grinding matter this much? Why did it become, basically, one of the most important habits your ancestors ever picked up? Because raw grain is almost useless to a human body. The seed of a wild grass is wrapped in a tough fibrous shell, and the starch packed inside it sits in a tight, crystal-like structure that your gut can't break down efficiently. Eat it raw, and you get almost nothing out of it. You genuinely get more energy chewing on bark. But crack that husk, grind the starch into a fine powder, add heat, and something changes at the chemical level. The heat unfolds that crystal structure, a process researchers call gelatinization, and suddenly, the calories that were always technically in that seed become calories your body can actually absorb. Grinding and cooking grain isn't just food prep, it's closer to a biological hack. It's unlocking energy that was sitting right there the whole time, just out of reach, behind a lock your digestive system never evolved a key for. And here's a detail most people never think about. Compared to other great apes, your gut is small. A chimpanzee's colon, relative to its body size, is considerably larger than yours. Somewhere in your evolutionary past, your species traded gut size for brain size, and that's a rough trade if you're relying on raw plants for calories, because raw plant matter takes forever to digest and gives back very little for the effort. Cooking mostly solved that problem for meat, but grain is its own separate challenge, because a seed is quite literally built to survive a trip through an animal's gut intact, so it can sprout somewhere new. That tough shell isn't an accident. It's armor, designed by evolution to resist exactly the kind of digestion you're capable of. Grinding cracks that armor open. Heat finishes the job. Your gut was never built to handle wild grain on its own. Bread is the workaround. It's the technology your ancestors invented to force open a food source that nature had deliberately locked shut. And it's worth pausing on just how much this one workaround changed. Wild grasses grow almost everywhere on Earth, in places where fruit is scarce, where large animals are unpredictable to hunt, where the growing season is short and unforgiving. Before grinding and cooking made grain usable, all of that available plant matter was, functionally, wasted calories, sitting in plain sight, completely out of reach. The moment your ancestors cracked that lock, entire landscapes that used to be marginal, barely survivable terrain suddenly became viable places to live. That's not a small side effect. That's a huge expansion of exactly how much of the planet your species could actually call home. Think about how strange that actually is, when you slow down and look at it. Your species didn't wait around for evolution to give you a bigger gut, or sharper digestive enzymes, or some clever biological trick for breaking down tough plant fiber. Instead, you built the solution outside your own body. A stone became an extension of your stomach. Fire became a second, external digestive system, doing chemical work your intestines physically couldn't. That's not a small thing. That's one of the very first times your ancestors solved a biological limitation with a tool, instead of waiting for their bodies to catch up. Now picture what that actually looked like day to day, because it was nowhere close to effortless. You wake before the heat of the day sets in. You walk out with a woven bag slung over one shoulder into a field of wild grass that looks, to be honest, like nothing worth your time. You cut the seed heads free one stalk at a time with a small flint blade, and it takes hours to fill even a modest bag. Your fingers get raw. The stalks cut at your forearms if you're not careful. This isn't a stroll through a garden. It's closer to a full morning's work for what might amount to a single day's food. Back at camp, the real labor starts. You kneel on the ground in front of a flat stone, a smaller hand-sized stone gripped in both palms, and you push it back and forth across the grain, over and over and over, crushing husks, separating chaff, grinding what's left into something close to flour. Your knees ache almost immediately. Your lower back aches worse, a dull, familiar pain that anyone who does this work knows by heart. This will take another hour, maybe two, depending on how much bread the group needs tonight. Somewhere nearby, someone else is doing the exact same motion, because one person's arms can only grind so much grain before the light runs out. This is shared labor, repeated daily, woven so deeply into ordinary life that it probably didn't even register as remarkable. It was just Tuesday, except, of course, there was no Tuesday yet. There was only the grinding and the fire and whatever came next. You mix the flour with water into a rough dough, no yeast yet, just grain and water and effort, and you press it flat and lay it directly against the hot stones at the edge of the fire. A few minutes later you have bread. Dense, plain, nothing like what you'd recognize on a shelf today, but bread. Lightweight, it doesn't rot like meat, it doesn't bruise like fruit. You can carry it for days, and it will still be food when you need it, wrapped in a hide and tucked into a bag as you move on to wherever the next food source happens to be. That's the whole reason it was worth all that labor in the first place. For people who spent most of their lives walking from one food source to the next, a food this light, this dense, this storable wasn't a luxury, it was strategy. And that labor left a mark, quite literally, on the bodies that did it. Bioarchaeologists studying skeletons from early grain processing communities have found telltale signs of this work written directly into the bone. Curled toe joints, worn down from kneeling for hours at a time, collapsed vertebrae in the lower back, arm bones so dense and reshaped from the repetitive grinding motion that they resemble the bones of modern athletes who train for it. This work fell overwhelmingly on women in many of these communities, and their skeletons carry the receipt. Every loaf, in a very real sense, cost somebody something physical. Now here's the twist that took archaeologists completely by surprise. If bread came before farming, is it possible that bread is actually the reason farming started at all? The old story runs one direction. Humans settled down, grew crops, and bread followed naturally, but the evidence increasingly points the other way around. Making bread from wild grain is brutally labor-intensive, like you just walked through, low yield, enormous effort, and yet the finished product, dense, storable, portable energy, was clearly treated as something special. Growing evidence suggests early bread wasn't an everyday meal at all. It shows up disproportionately at what looks like feasts, gatherings, rituals. Which brings us to a place called Göbekli Tepe, in what's now southeastern Turkey. A massive ritual site built by hunter-gatherers, not farmers, somewhere around 9500 BCE, thousands of years before anyone in that region was deliberately planting seeds. Excavations there, led by the archaeologist Klaus Schmidt, uncovered evidence of large-scale grain processing, far more than a small hunting band would ever need just to feed itself. The theory Schmidt and others put forward is this: the pressure to gather enough wild grain for these huge communal gatherings, enough to make bread, and very possibly an early form of beer, since both start from the exact same ground grain and water, may be exactly what pushed people toward deliberately planting seeds in the first place. Not hunger for bread in the everyday sense. Hunger for enough bread, reliably, to keep feeding a crowd that had traveled from far away to gather at one sacred site. Sit with that for a second. Farming, The single biggest turning point in human history, the thing that eventually led to permanent villages, to cities, to writing itself, might trace back to people wanting a dependable supply of something as simple as bread. Not a grand plan to reshape civilization. Just people trying to make sure there was enough to eat and drink the next time everyone gathered together. And feeding a crowd like that took real organization, the kind hunter-gatherer bands don't usually need for their day-to-day survival. Somebody had to coordinate harvesting enough wild grain from multiple bands, possibly weeks in advance. Somebody had to store it without it rotting or getting eaten by rodents. Somebody had to manage dozens, maybe hundreds, of people all needing to be fed at once, at a site with no fields and no stored surplus waiting around. That kind of large-scale cooperation, built entirely around feeding people bread, might be one of the earliest blueprints for the kind of organized society that farming and later cities would eventually run on. Once wild grain became something worth planting on purpose, the plants themselves started to change too, shaped generation after generation, by which seeds got harvested and replanted. Wild wheat naturally shatters when it ripens, scattering its own seeds onto the ground to grow again on its own, which is fantastic for the plant and terrible for anyone trying to collect it by hand. Early farmers, probably without fully understanding why, kept favoring the rare stalks that didn't shatter, the ones that held their seeds long enough to be harvested whole. Plant those seeds again, year after year, and you're not just growing food anymore. You're slowly building a completely different plant, one that now depends entirely on humans to reproduce at all. Genetic and archaeological research points to a specific place where this actually happened first for one key grain. The Karakadag Mountains, in what's now southeastern Turkey, not far at all from Göbekli Tepe itself, appear to be where wild einkorn wheat was first domesticated, somewhere around 10,000 years ago. Every loaf of wheat bread you've ever eaten, in some sense, traces its lineage back to that one mountain range, and to people who had no idea they were founding an agricultural dynasty. They just wanted seeds that were easier to harvest. And here's what makes this whole story even stranger, honestly. Bread wasn't invented once by one clever group and then spread outward to everyone else. It was invented over and over again, independently, by people who never had any contact with each other. Ground corn became tortillas in Mesoamerica. Ground teff became injera in what's now Ethiopia. Ground rice, ground millet, ground whatever grew nearby, turned into some version of flatbread on nearly every inhabited continent, cooked on a hot stone or a clay surface, by people separated by oceans and thousands of years, who arrived at almost the exact same solution completely on their own. That's not a coincidence. That's what happens when the same basic problem shows up everywhere humans go. A starchy plant your body can't digest raw, a stone to grind it, a fire to cook it. Wherever those three things existed together, bread in some form eventually followed. It's less like one brilliant idea and more like a law of nature that ancient humans, again and again, on every continent, independently discovered. Now think about tomorrow morning. You'll probably eat bread without thinking twice about it. Toast, maybe. A sandwich later, you won't think about the 14,000-year chain of trial, error, and aching knees that put it in your hands so effortlessly. There's a small piece of evidence for how deep this runs, and it's hiding inside language itself. The English word companion comes from Latin com, meaning with, and panis, meaning bread. A companion, literally, is someone you share bread with, and it goes further than that, actually. Old English gave us the word hlafwyr, meaning loaf guardian, the person who protects and distributes the bread for everyone else, a word that, over centuries of shifting pronunciation, eventually wore down into the word Lord. Somewhere underneath every use of that word today sits a person whose entire authority once boiled down to one basic responsibility: make sure everyone gets fed. Language has been quietly carrying the memory of this whole story for over 1,000 years, and almost nobody notices, because bread became so reliable, so cheap, so available, that it stopped feeling like an achievement at all. It just became background noise, wallpaper, the thing you grab without a second thought on your way out the door. You live in a world where bread costs you nothing but a walk to a store shelf, or honestly, less than that, a few taps on a phone and someone else brings it to your door. Your ancestors spent entire mornings on their knees, hours of aching, repetitive labor, for a fraction of what you can buy in 30 seconds without even glancing at the price. The gap between those two realities is, honestly, kind of staggering when you actually sit with it. And yet, in a strange way, nothing about the reason you eat bread has changed at all. You eat it for the same reason a hunter-gatherer knelt over grinding stone 14,000 years ago. It's dense, it's reliable, it fits into a life that's always moving. The tools changed. The effort changed almost beyond recognition. The underlying need never did. You're kneeling in dry grass, somewhere in the Jordanian desert, 14,000 years ago, and the seeds in front of you look like nothing worth eating. But you already know something the grass doesn't. You know how to turn nothing into everything. And every loaf you've ever eaten since is proof that someone, a long, long time ago, figured that out for you first.